What's going on, everyone? So get strapped in, get yourself a cup of coffee, get some snacks or whatever, because I got a massive video for you all today. Probably the biggest one I've done so far on the channel. As you all can see behind me, I have basically every single deck that's been played in the meta, and even some that are very, very fringe or very, very kind of mediocre in Star Wars Unlimited, and we're going to be ranking them on a tier list for early set 2. Now, as I said, this is early set 2. I'm sure this is going to shift and change as people get kind of interested in different archetypes or potentially find ways to counter certain archetypes. But regardless, this is probably going to be at least an hour and a half long video. So get strapped in. We got a lot to talk about. I'll have timestamps in the description down below for every single leader that I'm going to talk about, as well as kind of the criteria and some things that I have to consider. Also, I had a request last time I did a set 1 deck tier list where you wanted to put you wanted to see the leaders up on screen. So I'm going to try my best to go ahead and do that through the editing process. This is going to be a massive video, so if I miss something, I apologize. Before we start on the criteria, I want to mention I have a TCG player link in the description down below. Be sure to check that out if you want to pick up any of the leaders that I'm going to talk about today. And I also have started a Patreon just to kind of offer another way for you all to interact with me on a more personal level. I'm going to be starting our own personal Discord, as well as potentially setting up some viewer games and, of course, easier access to have direct communication with myself. So if you are interested in that, be sure to check that down in the description down below, and I'll be developing it over the next coming week. So without further ado, let's get started on the criteria. First things first, we got to talk about how I chose the decks that you're seeing on screen. Now, there are a lot of leaders in Star Wars Unlimited at this point. There are, well, 18 times 2, so 36 different leaders. And there are some that are, well, just better than others. Some that are more competitive, some that are being played in tournaments and actually having results. And there are some that are borderline unplayable. So for the decks slash leaders that are kind of on the weaker side, I at least gave them one deck or one combination that I have played with or that I've seen as its best kind of color combination for the tier list. So every single leader is represented on this list, but you also might notice that there are multiple versions of some leaders. Some leaders are exceptionally powerful and have various different color combinations on this list. The most egregious example is Boba Fett, which has all 4 color combinations. And that's because we've seen all 4 of these be played frequently. The 3 being Boba Yellow, Boba Green, and Boba Blue, all during set 1 and even during set 2. And all of them are still quite solid. And even with the addition of set 2, we've seen Boba Red added to the picture, which are all very solid decks. So if there is a leader with multiple different color combinations, that is because that deck is actually something that you might want to consider playing. Maybe they're not as strong as another. That's what the tier list is for. But it is something that you could consider bringing to your LGS if you wanted to try something a little bit different. With that said, how we're going to be ranking it with the tiers here. So S tier, this is what I would consider tier 1. There isn't, at least in my opinion, what I would consider a tier 0 or a deck that is just straight up unbeatable. There is a tier 1 though, where there are a couple of lists that are exceptionally powerful and are going to be some of the more competitive lists. These are decks that really do have an amazing shot, or perhaps the best shot, to actually take down cash tournaments. And these are the decks that are going to be the most competitive, super versatile, super solid kind of matchup against the metagame. A tier, this is like tier 1.5. These decks are just barely kind of out of the S tier. They're not going to be the absolute most competitive list, but these are decks that you can bring and have a real shot at taking down a tournament. They are very competitive lists, and they do have a really, really solid matchup against, well, the majority of the metagame, but maybe kind of line up poorly against some of the absolute best decks. Your B tier, this is where what I consider the fun category. Your B tier is going to be your LGS style decks. Your, for lack of a better word, F&M, but instead of Friday Night Magic, it's Friday Night Star Wars, right? These are the lists that, okay, I could definitely play this list and I could definitely win some games. I might not want to bring it to a tournament, like a cash tournament or anything like that, because there are going to be some better options. But these are lists that do have a shot at taking some games. And even if you did bring them to the tournament, I could see in some rare cases, you know, maybe getting into the top 8, maybe claiming the whole tournament. These are lists that are more often than not just lists that you want to try out and have some fun at your, you know, Friday night Star Wars. C tier, these are lists where they could use some help. These are going to be decks that really haven't come together. They have a glaring weakness, or perhaps don't match well against the metagame at all. Maybe people are already teched out against them. You know, maybe upgrades are just running rampant, and I'm trying to play an upgrade deck, and even if I, you know, just go with my game plan, I'm just going to get absolutely hated out by just people playing their normal decks. That's kind of where C tier lies. They're either really poor against the current metagame, or they're just lacking some pieces to really make them a cohesive deck, or potentially they have like a weak leader ability. D tier, these are the decks that honestly I could not find a reason to play them. And these are lists that I fought against. I've tried to find an advantage to playing this list over another list. This is where, spoiler alert, I think a lot of control lists are going to be down here, like kind of like random niche control lists, because control is shaping really poor against the early set 2 meta. Again, this is an early set 2 list. But D tier are going to be either leaders that are absolutely kind of atrocious, like their leader ability doesn't do anything, or it just doesn't have any synergies with the current card pool that we have right now, or it just is absolutely awful to play and you get absolutely hosed against certain cards in the metagame, and it is just basically unplayable, like actively unfun to play D tier decks. And there are going to be a couple of those. So those are going to be the kind of tier criteria. Those are the decks that or at least the thoughts behind the decks that I have chosen. I'm sure there's going to be a list or two here, maybe 20, that someone wants me to put on here, like, oh no, you're missing Dr. Aphra double yellow, and I've been playing that recently. If there's a list like that, let me know in the comment section down below, because I'm sure I'm missing a ton of them. Again, I just took the most kind of strong, most popular, most competitive list that I've seen throughout my massive amount of playing through Star Wars Unlimited on Karabast, and also in paper, and that's where we're gonna go from here. So if you have any other thoughts, let me know in the comment section down below. But let's get started with Dr. Aphra. So starting us off with Dr. Aphra Blue, I will be rating all of these lists live, at least for me. And so I might make some adjustments as we go through the list. I'll just probably pop them on the list as I talk about them initially and then place them. But Dr. Aphra Blue, this is kind of a really fun list. To be honest, this is one of the few, well, spoiler alert, little lower rated list that I actually enjoy playing, because I think the thematic of it's really, really cool. This is oftentimes a more controlling list, and it's trying to use Dr. Aphra's ability to discard things from the top of your library or deck and try to recycle things using restock and trying to get that control game running. It's a really cool list. I think it has an awesome idea, and maybe in the future when control's a little bit better situated, I can definitely see people playing Dr. Aphra Blue. The one big problem with Dr. Aphra is that she doesn't really fit in any of the more aggressive decks, because, well, it's really directly competing with Boba, as it is cunning villainy. And the best shell would be blue, as far as I've found, and yet it still isn't that good, and it's a control list. So poor leader, very situational, and you're playing control, all negatives. This to me, and I know some people are going to hate this, is a D tier. It's my favorite D tier deck. I've played a lot of it because I am a control enjoyer. I like playing control, but it is just really difficult to do in the meta. You get hosed by Lurking TIE Phantom, and yes, you can play Frozen in Carbonites, Evacuates, and Entrenched, but it just doesn't actually do enough even then, because even if you are doing all that stuff, you could still get aggroed out. If TIE Phantom's not even in the deck, you could still just lose. Crate Dragons are a problem, and you don't even have a powerful leader to kind of reset you on the board like maybe even a Boba Blue deck might. Gonna be a D tier to start us off. Next one on our list is Boba Fett. I think most of these are kind of alphabetical based on how I named my files, but Boba Blue, Boba Green, Boba Red, and Boba Yellow. This is the only leader on this list that has all 4 color combinations in the list, which is pretty crazy, but probably not surprising. Boba Fett got a lot better. And I'm going to start us off with Boba Blue. So Boba Blue is, generally speaking, a little bit more of a controlling list. You're leveraging the fact that you have an early Boba flip, a very powerful leader, and the ability to kind of get all those resources back to control your opponent and then just outvalue them. Unfortunately for Boba Blue, this is still a more controlling list, and you do get kind of wrecked by a lot of random cards in the meta. Like, it's really rough against a Crate Dragon. TIE Phantom can do a lot of work against Boba Blue, but it is one of, if not the best control lists that I've found lately. That said, I don't actually think it is extremely powerful. I would drop it near the higher end of B tier compared to, of course, some of the absolutely amazing decks that we have, including, well, Boba Green, which is a standard mid-range list / ramp list that we were seeing in set 1, but with the improvements of, you know, things like Forlom, Zuckuss. You even have Boba Fett's armor. You have things like Phase 3 Dark Trooper, which is just a straight up upgrade over Cell Block Guard. You have Mauls now, which work really well because you're running Underworld cards. You actually got quite a few different upgrades with the new Boba Green, and you even have things like Price on your head, which can really help you out with ramping into Boba even quicker. This is a really solid list. I do think that it is not the strongest Boba list, and I think that that's been, well, maybe the consistency between set 1 and set 2, but it is still an A tier list and a very tough list to beat. Next up, we got Boba Red. Now, Boba Red is more of like a triple dark raid vehicle list with like Ruthless Raiders. We're running things like disabling Fang Fighters, punishing ones, and it's much more of an aggro, sort of like traditional aggro list where you're not trying to tempo out your opponent necessarily. You're just playing a bunch of units, getting in for a bunch of damage, and then using triple dark raid as sort of a burn card, just getting in for a bunch of damage if you can. It is, in my opinion, a little bit weaker than Boba Blue. We've seen both these lists a lot in the videos, and they do work for sure. It's just that Boba Red has a little bit more inconsistency built in, because sometimes the triple dark raid can absolutely do kind of mediocre work, and sometimes it can just completely murder your opponent. It really kind of depends on the situation. And then following that up, you're kind of playing with all these a little bit weaker red cards or aggression cards alongside Boba, where the true strength in Boba lies leveraging the fact of getting extra resources, and Boba Red wants to play units and attack your base rather than, you know, trading off with units or getting rid of units. So it's a little bit harder to actually trigger Boba's effect of making an enemy unit leave the battlefield in Boba Red, which makes it a little bit weaker. But then we talk about Boba Yellow, and this is an S tier deck. Now, Boba Yellow, this is, if you don't want to take my word for it, you can look at the two top 8s that we had about a week ago. We had 6 of the top 8, 4 of one of the top 8s, and 2 of one of the other top 8s having Boba Yellows in it. So a total of 6 of those 16 decks were actually Boba Yellow, and it absolutely crushed. It is just so powerful, especially with some of the new set 2 cards. It wasn't a big upgrade, but Boba Yellow didn't really need a big upgrade. The fact that you're just playing such an early leader deploy with such a high powered stat line, playing Cunnings, which is arguably one of the most powerful cards in Star Wars Unlimited, period. The ability to kind of wreck your opponent's hand with Bodhies and the new Bazine at certain points in the game. There are just so many different tools Boba has to attack you on, preventing you from having a board, preventing you from having the correct play in your hand, while also deploying their own board and leveraging the additional resources they're getting from Boba Fett, unlike Boba Red. It is a tempo aggro list and usually kills by around turn 4, turn 5, and it can be really devastating. Boba Yellow, and S tier. That's going to be Boba. Let's move on to Bo-Katan. Bo-Katan only has one here, and it is going to be the Bo-Katan blue list. I've had a lot of fun with this. This is mainly a Mandalorian focused list to leverage her action, but as many of you pointed out when we had that video playing Bo-Katan blue, you're actually not running the Mandalorian in this list, you're running Obi-Wan. She's actually a pretty strong leader, as the more I've played with Bo-Katan, the more I've found many ways to take advantage of her action ability. There's just so many ways to kind of just get that little bit of extra damage in to finish off units, or just, you know, shrink some opponent's units' toughness so that your earlier game units actually trade with them. And then coming down with a Darksaber in some cases, or just playing high value Mandalorian units. There's a couple really powerful ones like Mandalorian Warrior coming down as a 3/3 that gives you an experience token. Ketsu Onyo can just completely own games. You have things like disabling Fang Fighter, which is a Mandalorian and works well against the meta. And even something like the Armorer coming down and giving 3 shield tokens could be absolutely massive. I've been pretty impressed with Bo-Katan. I don't think she's quite above the Boba blue list that we have, but I think she's a solid B tier list with a pretty nice core of Mandalorians and definitely a reasonably powerful deck that can definitely get you some wins. The only tricky thing about Bo-Katan here is you are in some cases playing, well, a little bit of a tribal deck, and if you don't have the pieces on the board, or you can't keep your pieces on the board, then sometimes your deck looks a lot worse. Like Mandalorian Warrior, Mandalorian Armor, Darksaber, Armorer, all these cards get worse if you're not able to keep all the pieces on the board, and that can look a little bit poor. Not to mention her action doesn't do anything if you can't attack. So gonna be a B tier for me. Next one up, we got ourselves Bossk Blue. Now, Bossk Blue is not really a control list. All we're doing with Blue is being able to leverage some really, really nice bounty options and getting some really, really awesome kind of longer grind health based game where you're able to restore a ton of HP and kind of just kill your opponent while healing up all the damage that they're doing to you. One of the most important cards in this list is actually the Client. Being able to pass bounties on to whoever you want is really, really important with Bossk, because just dealing an extra damage to something every single turn is really, really quite impactful. The problem with Bossk Blue is you aren't able to claim some of the bounties as easily as Bossk Green. I think Bossk Blue is an archetype that does a decent amount of work, but does have some decent shortcomings. To me, this is a C tier list where Bossk Blue can have these games where you're just absolutely restoring out of your mind and you're able to really remove a lot of your opponent's units by getting bounties everywhere you want. And then there's sometimes where restoring doesn't really do enough because you're just getting outvalued or out kind of mid-ranged in the middle stages of the game. And that's where Bossk Green comes in, because Bossk Green is much more focused on sort of the game plan of Boba Green, as you're trying to resupply, you're trying to price on your head, you're trying to ramp into Bossk a little bit while also playing your bounties. One of the most powerful turn ones in the game, besides just putting a lot of power on the board like Death Star Stormtrooper or Greedo, is going turn 1 Stolen Landspeeder into Bounty Hunter's Quarry. Bounty Hunter's Quarry is, at least in my opinion, one of the best bounty cards that we have, because you can go Stolen Landspeeder, goes to your opponent's side of the board. You can then upgrade your own Stolen Landspeeder with Bounty Hunter's Quarry. And because Stolen Landspeeder already had a bounty, you don't even need the Bounty Hunter's Quarry, but you're able to deal 1 damage to your own Stolen Landspeeder. Then the next turn, deal another damage, and suddenly you have a 4/3 with that Stolen Landspeeder coming back. And you get to claim the Bounty Hunter's Quarry, so you can get like a Super Laser Technician or a Phase 3 Dark Trooper or you know, Gamorrean Guard or whatever you want to get off the top, or whatever you can get. And then you can follow that up with another 3 resource play. It is insanely hard to deal with. And even if you don't necessarily do that, you can have some absurd turns where you like ramp 2 to 3 to 4 resources in a single turn, because you can, you know, go ahead and Super Laser Technician and hit a price on your head with Bossk Flip, and you like triple ramp, and it can just get to things like Darth Vader, Crate Dragons absurdly quickly. To me, this is an A tier list. Crate Dragon really helps out this list in a lot of matchups, but also just getting to Mauls and Vaders and ramping, playing a solid mid-range list is really powerful with Bossk. Cad Bane Green is up next, and this is a list that I had a lot of fun with tuning and playing with. If you didn't see my video the other day with Cad Bane Green, I tuned it a little bit more towards beating some of the meta decks, at least that we found on Carabas that we were playing against, and what the lists that I was seeing in tournaments. And this performed admirably. It did really quite well. I did try to not make the decks explicitly just to deal with Boba Yellow. when I was building Cad Bane green, I was trying to go for general utility, but also specific cards that are going to deal with a lot of the meta. And that includes Sabine green, that includes Boba yellow, those types of decks. And to be honest, this performs really well at dealing with them. The ability to get rid of shield tokens, the ability to just do a couple of extra damage is really, really nice. The kind of cards that you're playing in Cad Bane have a lot of value and trade really nicely with opponents' units, usually because of the extra damage. And sometimes you just get some free value. You know, if you're playing against Kylo Ren, if you're playing against Darth Vader, you could sometimes just play a unit, kill a unit. If you're playing against Greedos, you can just kill their units for free. You're playing against like Rey, for example, or whatever, and yeah, they get some experience tokens, but your units can actually trade with her units because the extra damage from Cad Bane. It actually does pretty well. And I'm gonna have to drop this at the lower end of A tier, maybe closer to the higher end of B tier, but we'll see how everything shapes up as we go along. It does do really well against Boba Yellow, and that's one of the reasons why I like it higher up on the list. It also performs pretty well against things like Sabine as well, which we'll get to in just a moment, with the ability to play things like Salacious Crumb, Greedos, many one-drops, but also Maclunkies, you know, Crafty Smugglers, these types of cards, cheap cards that allow you to deal with your opponent's units and not take too much damage. Between all those and the pings that you're getting from Cad Bane, really does do a lot of work. Unfortunately for you Cassian lovers, as I know that there's a lot of you out there, there's only really one deck that has really remained something that you can do with Cassian, and that's Cassian yellow. Yes, you can go Cassian green and play like the heroism green shell with ECL and things like that. You can play Cassian blue, you can play Cassian double red. These are all fine. The problem with Cassian, and the reason why I like yellow as well, is you are prevented from deploying your leader comparatively to a lot of the other really good heroism aggro decks, because it comes down on 6 resources, and that's a big difference. And also comes down on 6 resources as a 4/6, and your action in the front side doesn't actually give you any combat power, which is really, really important. Drawing additional cards in heroism decks is never a bad thing, right? These aggro heroism decks, never a bad thing, but it's not something that you want to be doing over dealing more damage. And when you consider the other heroism kind of yellow, or heroism red yellow, green yellow, red yellow, whatever it is, they all kind of incentivize getting more and more damage in. Those are the ones that are higher up on the list. So to me, this is going to be a C tier list, and it's definitely a lot weaker, especially since you can't even leverage things like Wrecker or Poe all that well. And if you're playing green, then you lose a lot of the yellow strengths that allow you to even get some work in with Cassian, things like Millennium Falcon, things like Surprise Strike. Just getting in for a lot of tempo-based damage is one of the ways you can kind of make up for Cassian's downside. But you could also just play Sabine yellow, unfortunately. Chewie green. This one is one that I have someone in paper that loves playing Chewies, played some Wookiees and everything. So I've fought against a lot of Chewie green in paper. I've also fought against it a lot during set 1 and increasingly less so in set 2. This is a deck that I would have probably put into the middle / higher end of B tier in set 1. The Sentinels can be quite nice with the action. Him coming down on 7 resources and just being this a massive body is actually pretty nice. Especially when you're playing green and you can ramp into it. The problem with set 2 is that you have actually things that can just one-shot it, even in aggro lists. Like if you're playing Sabine green, for example, you just drop a Wrecker, and yeah, it trades with Chewbacca with ECL, but you also get in for damage. Like, it's not this insurmountable body that you cannot pass. This guy has gotten a decent amount weaker because of things like that. Or even if you're playing ramp and you're trying to like, oh, I'm going to get this big Sentinel. Well, suddenly someone's going to drop a Crate Dragon on you and you are feeling way worse playing Chewie green, unfortunately. You could play Crate Dragons in that list, but then it's costing 11. And you really don't want to play red because, well, you can't ramp into Chewie, and Chewie comes down too late, so you'll just get overrun. Unfortunately for me, this is a C tier list as well. It's going to be a list that really has a hard time kind of keeping up with aggro or even getting more value out of your deck in the late game. Chirrut is up next, and this is kind of like the grandfather of the Force discard decks that we are seeing nowadays, in particular with Rey Red, but also if you saw my Luke Red video, which is very parallel to that. Chirrut was the original originator slash original version of this archetype in set 1, where you're running things like, you know, force throws and your force cards and trying to pump up a big Chirrut. Chirrut, I would have put probably in the tier 1.5 area, into the A tier, maybe like the middle to the lower end of A tier, with Chirrut nearing the end of set 1. The problem with Chirrut now is that there are a lot of main deck upgrade hate. There's a lot of ways to just deal with big leaders such as Rivals Fall, or big units in general. And there is more ways to play this Force deck that, in my opinion, have performed way better than Chirrut. And not even necessarily in my opinion, it's just we see them actually taking better spots in recent tournaments, not just my experience with playing these various variations of Force discard decks. To me, this is going to be a B tier list. I would put it slightly above the Boba Red list, but it's going to be nearing the lower end of B tier. Not that it's terrible, but there are better options that are a lot higher on the list that do basically the exact same thing with the exact same color combination. Next up on our list is Fennec Shand. Now, this is a list that I actually had a lot of interactions with. One of the people that I know actually ended up fighting against me on Carabash a couple of times, just randomly playing this Fennec Red list. And this is one of the great travesties of, I think, set 2 leaders. This is a leader that when I first saw, I immediately said, I'm not sure if we can even get any value out of Fennec Shand's leader ability, because the biggest thing with ambush is you're usually playing ambush and able to ambush the unit that is just played on the turn prior. And what that allows you to do is keep your unit around while killing their units. But the problem with Fennec Shand's ability is that you have to pay 1 extra resource to play that unit, and you can't even ambush big costed units. So you really lose the advantage of ambush, because usually the ambush will then just trade with your opponent's unit, and that is a lot weaker than actually getting the value in of keeping your unit around. And then to add to all that, she deploys as a 4/4 for 5 resources. We've talked about IG-88 in the past being a 5/4. She is even worse than a 4/4. She has Saboteur, but that doesn't really matter. She just gets killed by like your standard 3 resource plays, and sometimes even your 2 resource plays. It is kind of crazy. Definitely. Or 3 resource plays or 4 resource plays, not even considering the 5 resource plays. It is really, really quite sad. I'm gonna have to put her, honestly, I would put her in the D tier. Even though she's playing that heroism red yellow shell, there are by far so many different options. I would take Cassian yellow over this any day, and I've just not really been a fan of Fennec Shand. I really wish she was better. If she was able to ambush out way bigger units, then I could see some value there. But early game, it's not valuable, and by the time it might be, it's not early game anymore, and well, you can't really do anything with the ambush. So gonna be in D tier for me. Next one up is another travesty of set 2, I would say, in Finn. This is Finn Green. There are a lot of people trying to mess around with Finn Green lately. I've seen some, thumbnails pop up. I don't watch a ton of Star Wars Unlimited videos necessarily, besides like the actual tournaments, but I do see, the decks pop up, and I've seen some people mess around with Finn Green. This is what I tried to do as well when I was testing around with Finn Green initially for set 2. You have some fun cards, specifically Inspiring Mentor can do some cool things with Finn where, you attach to something, you get some experience around, and then you exchange experience for shield tokens. The problem is that action, even what I just said there, that's like dream scenario. I've played Sabine greens, I've played Boba greens, I've played Luke greens, I've tried Inspiring Mentor, and getting it on a unit and getting experience on another unit is kind of difficult to do. So that's like dream scenario. But then with Finn, you have to get another action to exchange that experience for a shield token, and that's not even like that crazy of an upgrade. You're exchanging an experience token for a shield token. The fact that you have to go ahead and defeat an upgrade on your units to get a shield token is really, really rough. So unfortunately, that action's pretty weak. And then he deploys as a 5 resource 4/6, which, isn't terrible. That's like average. Not really too worried about that. But his on attack trigger doesn't actually do that much, because again, you have to go back to building this like upgrade base, like slash unit based synergy, and then you're not really getting that much value out of it. To me, this is a C tier list. It is not Aphra or Fennec level, but it is pretty mediocre and one of the weaker leaders from set 2. Next one on our list is Gar Saxon, a little bit of a fan favorite. I can't tell you how many times people ask me to do some Gar Saxon content. I've done Gar Saxon green, but we first got to talk about Gar Saxon blue, because this is also a list I've come across a decent amount, and I have tried a little bit myself. One of the big things with Gar Saxon blue is you get access to Vigilance, which is just an extremely powerful event, one of the most powerful events in the game, similar to Command, Cunning, and that type of stuff. These are just like the most powerful cards in the game, and it does a lot of work, you know, giving shield tokens, defeating stuff, healing stuff. It has a lot of versatility, but that's really the only card that I'm excited about in double blue Gar Saxon, besides like Security Complex as your base. You could also play things like Sugi, which does do some work. But to be honest, this is the weaker of the two Gar Saxon lists. And the big thing is a lot of people try to play Second Chance with this, which is just not a very powerful card. I have been in a lot of scenarios where people try to play it on early game units, and it's just like 4 resources for buying back like your cheap 2 or 3 resource play, which is not really a good trade-off. Or, you know, it's just sitting dead in their hand. To me, this is definitely a C tier Gar Saxon list. I have been pretty unimpressed with it. But Gar Saxon green, on the other hand, has a lot more advantages with it. One of the big things is you get to play ECL. Energy Conversion Lab is an immediate bump in terms of the viability of a deck, at least in the experience of, well, my time on Star Wars Unlimited, as well as what we've seen off of tournament standings, right? We've seen Boba green take the top, Sabine green take the top a lot of the times, and that's a large part due to Energy Conversion Lab, and Gar Saxon is no different. You also get access to some powerful green villainy cards like Super Laser Technician. You get Phase 3 Dark Troopers. You get ECL plus Gideon, which is a nice combination. This is actually a pretty solid list. I wouldn't say it's higher than B tier, because even though you can get some nice value out of pumping up your units with upgrades, you have to play these upgrades, and that could be a little bit weak against some decks and get you in awkward situations where you have upgrades but no units, or units but no upgrades. Or B, you have, well, kind of cards that are a little bit more mediocre because you're trying to pass around upgrades and you don't have the setup for it. Think Mandalorian Warrior, the TIE Vanguard, and that type of stuff. So higher B tier list, not bad, but just not really as powerful as some of the other things I've seen so far. Next on our list, we got ourselves Moff Gideon Red. Now, this is a list that I've seen people play some Moff Gideon. Okay, I've seen a lot of Moff Gideon Blue. I've seen a lot of Moff Gideon Yellow. But the list that I found the most success with is Moff Gideon Red, because of all the additional cheap troopers and cheap kind of units that you can play that are actually high value. Things like Death Star Stormtrooper are amazing in this deck. It actually gives you a lot of value for playing these cheap units like Super Laser Technician, even though you're not trying to ramp necessarily, although there are some cards that you can just play in Command Villainy that are good, like Vader's and Maul's. But Super Laser Tech can suddenly actually trade with an opponent's 2 resource play because of Gideon's ability. And so that actually does give you a little bit of value. The problem with this is this action's only useful temporarily, usually, and he deploys as a 5 resource 3/6, although he does attack technically as a 4/6. He just doesn't do enough on the front side action alongside the kind of flip here to close out the game. I would have loved to see them give Moff Gideon the option to actually attack a base with this +1/+0 instead of just a unit, which could just guarantee some additional damage. And I would actually probably put him closer to the A tier. But for the time being, I'm actually just going to drop him, well, unfortunately, at the bottom of B tier. I've been really kind of unimpressed with the Moff Gideon Red, Moff Gideon in general as a leader, and he's going to be at the end of B tier, right where we started him. Next one up, or next ones up, are the Han Green and Han Yellow OG Han. This has been a pretty impressive list, and with set 2, we've gotten kind of a lot of additional options that make the deck a lot more exciting. Marauder is one of the exciting parts of the new Han Green, but you also get access to things like QiRa. You get access to the Tech DJ combo. You get access to things like Spark of Hope, which all are pretty solid. And one of the big things is this list can really make you just feel bad about your deck sometimes. Going Han Solo and getting some early ramp, or just playing a 3-drop on turn 1 like a Sonari Peacekeeper, trying to keep yourself alive, trading off with early units, ramping, and then getting down like an early Han Solo unit that could just wipe out your entire opponent's board every single turn is really oppressive. And then in some other matchups, you are doing things like stealing a resource and defeating that resource that you stole, so that that DJ can't, or they can't kill DJ and get their resource back. So it kind of deals well against some other mid-range decks, which Han did have some trouble against in some previous set 1. This is a powerful list, and maybe some people disagree with me, but I've actually been really impressed with Han Green. And this is the list where I think Tech DJ is actually a good combo, whereas other lists I've been a lot less impressed with, because this is a list that guarantees you additional ramp with your actual action, which allows you to get down an early tech and allows you to get down an early DJ, where other lists have too many other things to go and do first before they can actually get that combo online. This is where Tech DJ actually has a home, and it does some work, as well as just completely outclasses aggro in a lot of situations if you have a good draw with a really quick Han Solo and like some really nice valuable early units. Han Green gonna be an S tier, a little bit weaker, quite a bit weaker than Boba Yellow, as it doesn't dominate quite as hard, but it is still very strong, and I'm gonna have to give it an S tier. Han Double Yellow, this is a list that I have played quite a bit just because I like playing with cunning. It's also a list that I've seen quite a few other people play, and it is really strong. As I mentioned earlier, Han is the place where I like to play the Tech DJ combo, and Han Yellow isn't really any different. You don't get as much ramp, but you don't really need a ramp to play the Tech DJ combo with Han, because he has built-in ramp, temporary ramp, and that's going to allow you to do the same thing. And Double Yellow Han allows you to really tempo out people with the Tech DJ, with QiRas, with, you know, Cunnings, as it's one of the most powerful cards in Star Wars Unlimited in general. This to me is like a bottom A tier list. It is powerful, quite powerful, but it's not quite as good as some of the other lists above it, and it's not nearly as good as its bigger brother in Han Green. Hera Red is up next, and I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. I was hoping Hera would get maybe a Spectre card, maybe just one of them, you know, add into the pool. Hera Green was the list that I had played a lot during set 1, and it is pretty nice to play, but there are so many just powerful red heroism cards that aren't Spectres that I think just playing red ended up being more powerful, and this is what I'm seeing people play Hera with. It's not atrocious, like absolutely unplayable, but there just doesn't seem to be a reason to play Hera. Like, yes, you can play things like Chopper or Ezra or Ghost in your deck, but those cards aren't even that good with set 2. Like, I wouldn't want to play Chopper usually, or I wouldn't want to play Ezra necessarily. Like, it's just a 3/4 for 3 resources that potentially draws you additional cards, and that could be good in some decks, but it's not even that good when you're trying to play like an aggro list. And then she deploys a 6 resource 4/6. It doesn't even have like a extremely relevant on attack trigger. It's just all kind of mediocre. To me, this is unfortunately like a bottom C tier. You could even drop it in the D tier category. The thing that's preventing me from doing that is you are playing red heroism, red-green heroism, which is just like a really solid color combination, and you do have powerful cards, and you can just win games by playing Pose and by playing Wreckers. It's just that, do you really want to be buying Pose and Wreckers and then playing them in Hera? Probably not. Next one on our list is my favorite showcase, or one of my favorite showcase, I should say, in Hondo. He is such a cool leader. I wanted to make him work. Hondo Yellow. Honestly, I'm looking at Hondo, and I think we made a mistake with Hera. I think Hera should be in D tier. And you know where Hondo should go? Also in D tier. Even though Hera is playing the red-green heroism, like I mentioned, I would have to put the same criteria over on Hondo, who's playing the yellow command villainy, which is what Boba is playing. Here's the thing. when you compare them to their counterparts in these color combinations with the different leaders, they are a significant downgrade. You compare Hondo to Boba green, like Hondo yellow to Boba green, it is night and day. So Hondo's ability to get some value when you smuggle things out, you're not really smuggling things out all the time. And usually when you're smuggling things out, it's like nearing the end of the game and the smuggle is just to kind of push you over the finish line and the experience token doesn't even actually come into play. And then you get a 6 to deploy leader who's a 3/7. Yes, it attacks as 4 power, like sure, but that's still not enough. You're just not smuggling. The fact that smuggle forces you to pay extra generally for the cards kind of negates the advantage of getting an experience token off of Hondo. And it's just so much weaker. It is so much weaker than playing Boba green. And for that, it's got to be in the D tier because the leader ability is just so mediocre and you're barely ever using it. D tier list for me. Next one up is Hunter Red. And I know I just talked about green red Heraism. And I know all the things that I said about Hera kind of apply to this in that you can play Wreckers, you can play Pose and still win games. But also, the leader doesn't do anything. The front side, in Hera's case, you get to play some like random specters that give you either minor additional options, but generally speaking, you don't even care about those options really. In Hunter's case, you get this like weird ability to pay extra resources to like get you a card back from your resource pile that like if you set up the right circumstances where you have a card in play, you get to essentially draw that card from your resource pile. But then it's got to be a unique unit, which means that your unit has to die in order for you to play it. And that means you're drawing essentially a cheap unit that you might not want to play in the later stages. Like it's just like did you listen to what I just said? Like those are all niche scenarios. Heck, we have like Cassian, and I would take Cassian's action over Hunter's action any day of the week. And that's not even to consider the fact that he's a 7 to deploy leader in red green heroism, which is normally a little more aggro based. And he's not even like that impressive. He's a 5/8 overwhelm. Like if you use like a 5/8 overwhelm with like a Vader ability to deal 2 to something, like maybe he's a little bit better, but he's just a 5/8 overwhelm. You don't even get to turn 6 all that often. And if you are, then you don't want to be flipping a 5/8 overwhelm. That's like not even that scary. It is, to me, an absolute D tier, and it's arguably one of the worst lists, like worst leaders and decks in the game, because people get fooled into trying to play Echoes and Omegas, and like, well, you can't play Omega in the red version, but like the clones, and it just doesn't work at all. I've tried so much. I'm really disappointed because I love the Bad Batch. I love this showcase, but he is terrible. This list is pretty terrible, especially when you consider it again compared to all the lists above that are in the exact same color combinations with a little bit of a different leader and a lot of advantage when it comes to those different leaders. Next up, we got Iden, and we got to talk about one of the few control lists that I actually think is somewhat playable in double blue Iden. This was a list that we got to see a lot of in set 1, but again, control got a lot worse. You have to start putting cards in your deck to deal with these specific cards that are in the meta these days. Double blue Iden does have the strength of being able to play things like Vigilance for 4 resources. You do get access to kind of the super laser blasts of the world. You still get access to Entrenched. You still get access to Search Your Feelings, Avengers, and things. But it is a lot harder to control the board, and it's a lot harder to finish the games. Avenger isn't the powerhouse that it once was. There are just so many ways to kind of go around it or outvalue it, which is a little bit odd. And so, unfortunately, Iden has dropped a lot. I would have put it close to the top of A. I think I put it in S tier in the last time I did this video, but like nearing the end of set 1, I probably would have put it like top of A, like bottom of S. To me now, this is like a B tier list. I would put it at like the top of B tier. I think it's solid, but I don't think it's nearly as good as it once was, especially considering even her flip doesn't do as much. The healing can be nice, but like a 4/4 shielded for 6 resources is very mediocre. It doesn't help you kind of bring back the game in your favor. Iden green, on the other hand, is a very different version of Iden. Iden double blue is a much more hard control list. Iden green is a much more soft control list with more of a mid-range / ramp plan where you still get to play things like Vaders and you still get to play things like Arquintan's Assault Carrier, Devastator, and stuff like that. And to me, that's a lot more valuable and actually does do some reasonable amount of work. I think that it's slightly better than Iden Blue, but not that much better. And in fact, I don't even know if I could put it further above Iden Blue than just like one spot forward. And maybe this is just like Iden Blue is kind of that mediocre right now in the current meta, and I should drop it. You know what? Actually, considering you have Boba Blue here, I think that I should put Iden Blue just behind Boba Blue, because these are a similar style of deck, but I think Boba, from what we've seen, is, well, Boba, not I think, is a much more proactive control list rather than a reactive one, which is a lot more advantageous, especially since you can also deploy Boba a lot easier and control the board. So I think Iden Green is better than Iden Blue. We are still seeing Iden Greens show up here and there, but the control lists are a lot harder to play, and there's a lot more things to actually punish them in the meta. So to me, these are both B tier lists. Iden Green, quite a bit better, but still not good enough to crack into A tier. Oh man, I know some people are absolutely waiting for some IG gameplay, and I'm hoping to bring some IG Green at some point. IG Green is a pretty fun list, but it still has the same problems as it did before, in which you need to flood the board with a bunch of units to get any relevancy for his action on the front side. And then even if you do get some extra points of damage, if you just compare this to like a Sabine who deploys a turn earlier than IG and, well, dies to even less things than IG does, but she oftentimes will be able to get in for like 3 damage at least. And even if IG lives for a single attack, he's only getting in 5 damage, maybe some more, you know, if you got some other units on the battlefield. But Sabine would have attacked for another 3, so she's even doing more than IG. And IG just dies to so many things and doesn't even have the guaranteed ability to get an extra damage in with your units, because it has to have a unit on the battlefield and it has to have more units than your opponent, which in some cases is really difficult, especially if you're fighting against, you know, Kylos, or you're fighting against Sabine Greens. They can flood the board in some cases better than you can. And to be honest, it is really, really unfortunate to play IG. This is a reasonable aggro list. Like if you want to play it, I guess you can, but it just, there's too many scenarios in which it goes very, very poorly for you, and there's too much setup for it to actually do a lot of work. To me, this is a C tier list. Looking at the rest of the list, I think that we're gonna have to shift up some of these higher tier ones because we've got some powerful lists coming. The next one being Grand Inquisitor Blue, and this one has been really quite impressive. I didn't think it was going to be as strong as it is, but it actually does some major work. As I kind of memed on, or a lot of people memed on during the spoiler season 4 set 2, Grand Inquisitor, it felt like every card was like, oh, that's going to be a good card in Grand Inquisitor. And guess what? It was, and it is. Grand Inquisitor Blue is amazing. It does so much more damage than it used to. You have things like Sonara Sand, Warshear Tree Tender, Deathwatch Loyalist, Hylobot Enforcer, so many of the earlier units. Things like Clan Challengers that comes down in turn 4 as a 5 resource 3/6, but can be ready to attack for 6. Like, we didn't really have those options. We were playing things like Seventh to Sister, which is okay. Like, oh yeah, you get in for 3 damage, but this is much more of an aggro list. And so getting in for like 6 damage with a Clan and Challengers on turn 4, remember you can ready it up on that turn, is way more powerful than playing a Seventh Sister and attacking for 3 and maybe dealing some damage to your opponent's units. You have so many more options, so much more consistency in the deck. This to me is one of the sleepers of set 2. I have found it to be very powerful. I think the only downside to this list is the fact that some of the S tier decks can, in some cases, outpace it or just kind of out-tempo it. I'm looking at you, Boba Yellow. I'm looking at you, Sabine Green. Spoiler, Sabine Green, which is why it's A tier. Grand Inquisitor Yellow, on the other hand, is much more trick-based, and it's a lot weaker because you're not having that consistency of having so many powerful units on each point of the curve, which makes Grand Inquisitor Yellow a lot weaker. To me, this is more of in the bottom end of B tier, and honestly, I think I can probably shift Moff Gideon down into C tier. I don't think this list is pretty good. He's kind of hanging on to the bottom of B tier, but Grand Inquisitor Yellow, a lot weaker than Grand Inquisitor Blue. It does have the tricks available to you. You can use Jedha City, which can do some work, but Jedha City is really there to try to get some value trades with your units, right? Where you can kill something without taking damage. Security Complex is much more what Grand Inquisitor wants to do because it prevents your units from dying, allowing you to get in for some more damage. The only thing that you're really getting off of Grand Inquisitor in yellow that I've been impressed with are things like Surprise Strike, Hot Shot Blaster, and things like that. Outside of that, it's really just not as consistent and not even as much damage that you're pumping. Jabba is next up. We got ourselves Jabba Red here. Now, this is much more of a little bit of a fringe / niche Jabba list. I've seen a few people leverage Jabba Green Red here, and there's really two cards that I'm kind of excited about with Jabba in red, and that is Jango Fett and Krayt Dragon. Jabba is a little bit more of a ramp list. You can get to Krayt Dragons a lot easier, and Jango Fett is really good in the Jabba red list. You get to guarantee a bounty whenever you want it, and that allows you to attack it with Jango Fett as a 6/6 for 4 resources, getting damage into your opponent's base and getting you some cards, which is potentially extremely valuable. But it doesn't actually make up for the sheer power of Jabba Yellow and the cards that you have available to play in the earlier stages with Jabba Yellow. So to me, Jabba Red kind of situates itself around the middle to later parts of the B tier. Jabba Yellow, on the other hand, is actually going to be situated into the A tier. This is one of the most powerful combos that you can do in all of Star Wars Unlimited, but playing a unit, playing Jabba, or having a unit on the battlefield, playing Jabba, capturing an opponent's unit. It could be things like Poe Dameron, it could be things like Wrecker, it could be things like, 7 drops like Obi-Wan, or Obi-Wan's not 7 drops, Luke Skywalker's, Obi-Wan's, things like that. And you could just follow that up into Dryden Voss. And it says play the unit for free, remember, which is really important, but it just does some major game swinging actions. But that's not all you get from yellow. You also get things like, well, the earlier parts of the curve. Hunter the Haxion Brood, which ends up being a 4/3 shield, which is really quite powerful. You get access to Forlom and Zuckuss, which can be quite powerful. You get access to Greedos and Crafty Smugglers and things like that to help you get to that stage a lot easier and have you get you, or at least get you, a couple of different options to claim some of the bounties that you're going to be putting on your opponent's units, easier than playing red, with the exception of Jango Fett. Jabba Yellow, much more of my favorite Jabba list. You know those set 1 leaders that were pretty bad in set 1? Well, guess what? They are still pretty bad. We have IG down here, Cassian, we have Hera, and guess what? Jin is going to join the D tier just behind Fennec. It just doesn't do anything. It just doesn't do anything. The whole idea behind heroism red-yellow, heroism red-green, is to be a lot more aggro. And I know some people are like, well, why can't you just build a list that's more mid-range focused? Well, you could, but it kind of defeats the strength of yellow heroism and the cards that you have available to you. Your pool of cards gets a lot weaker when you're not doing the thing that those cards want to be doing. Now, I know that there's Poes, I know that there's Wreckers, but those cards are a lot weaker when you don't have ECL, and you're not having that with Jin Red or Cassian Yellow. So you are incentivized to play this more aggro deck, and if you are doing that, then Jin's action isn't really an action that you're going to be using in most of your games, because you're going to want to be hitting their base. And even if you are using it, there aren't like an insane amount of scenarios where it's going to give you absurd value. And then she also deploys as a 6 resource 4/7, which is like not a terrible flip, but it's 6 resources to flip, which is too late for a lot of the situations that you want to be in with heroism without giving you a significant damage increase on that flip turn. Same thing goes with Cassian, as I talked about earlier. You want to be getting a bunch of extra damage in with your units, which we'll talk about later on, which can do that, or giving you some more damage in the front side and then just using leader as the final nail in the coffin. But this doesn't have either. It's going to be a D tier list. I wouldn't recommend playing Jin. You could, again, these lists can get you wins. It can happen, and you can do some work, but it just isn't a list I would recommend playing. It just doesn't have really anything going for it. It needs something more, like some reason to be killing units, something that gives you a lot of value, like a Gideon, for example, that encourages you to trade with these units and get some value trades going. But right now, we don't have that in the game. Next up is Krennic Green, and I know a lot of you thought I was a little bit harsh on Krennic Green in set 1, and perhaps I was. I might have underrated it a little bit here in set 1. I think I put it into the middle of B tier, and I think it was closer to like the middle of A tier. But I think in set 2, Krennic has gotten actually quite a bit better alongside a lot of other decks, but it actually does compete. One of the things with Krennic green here is you do have ECL for, you know, the situations where that's important, but there are a lot of cards that just get you so much more value when you have the Krennic ability behind you. And flipping as a 5 resource 2/7 is pretty tanky, and that restore 2 is not irrelevant. One of the things about playing these more mid-range lists with Vigilance is you can play things like Vigilance and some of the more powerful Vigilance cards like Avenger if you want to in these lists, but you could also play things like Vader's, and you could still play some of the more valuable kind of on-curve plays, and that's exactly what Krennic's trying to do. One of the most powerful cards that you have in the list with, you know, more of this mid-range, like unit-based list is Gideon. And Gideon is still one of the most powerful 5 drops in the entire game. Getting those experience tokens racks up very quickly, especially when you have Krennic's ability again behind you, because you're able to go ahead and pump up those units, not just with the experience, but also with the damage they've dealt. This to me is actually an A tier list. I think slightly behind Cad Bane and Grand Inquisitor, because I'm a little bit more incentivized to play these more tempo, you know, in this case aggro decks, but in Cad Bane's case kind of controlling the board and getting in some damage. But Krennic is, you know, a little bit more of a quintessential mid-range ramp deck where you are restoring, kind of stalling out, and just playing higher value units and outvaluing your opponent in the long run. And Krennic does a really nice job of it. Better than Iden does by a decent margin, which is why he's in A tier and Iden is in B tier. And now we get to talk about probably the most fun leader I've played with within set 2. It's kind of a tie between this one and one other one we'll talk about in a little bit. Kylo Ren. We got 3 flavors of Kylo. This has been a really powerful list, but this is the most spiky list I've seen. This is the list, or these lists are extremely variants. Sometimes you win on turn 3, and sometimes you get destroyed like you've never been destroyed before, and some lists do it better than others. Starting us off with Kylo Green. I know this is the one that I immediately went to when I first started building Kylo. When set 2 was initially coming out, we just started seeing some cards. I was like, ooh, let's do a Palpatine's Return discard style of deck. I think that is a lot weaker. You can go in the mid-range style, but I think Kylo Ren's not really built for that. Instead, I've also tried like an ECL. Okay, let's play a green-red aggro deck and, you know, play the good green aggro cards. And to be honest, that also really didn't fit with the Kylo Ren style. To me, this ended up being a C tier list, but fortunately for us, it only gets better from there. I'm actually going to skip over Kylo Red because I do think it is better than the other 2 lists, and we'll kind of wait for that rating there. Kylo Yellow is the next one up, and this one is a much more on theme what Kylo wants to do. You also get a lot more powerful yellow cards, such as Greedo on turn 1, which is really well paired with Death Star Stormtrooper and just getting in for a bunch of damage. You get access to Hotshot Blaster. You get access to Surprise Strikes. You get access to, if you wanted to go the route, Triple Dark Raid. You get access to TIE Phantoms. You get access to basically all the tempo plays, all the extra damage things that you kind of are looking for in yellow, which is really nice. However, you don't have as much direct damage, and you don't have as much explosiveness with the deck. You don't really have that like X factor that double red Kylo has. So to me, this is more of like a B tier list where, yeah, you could really get some wins, and it's going to be a swingy game where in some games you're just going to win, some games you're going to like really hard lose, but you can at least do some decent amount of work. Kylo Red, on the other hand, is my favorite variant of Kylo, and I think I even posted a video on Kylo Red 2.0. This, to me, is an A tier list, but near the bottom of A tier. There are a lot of lists here in B tier that will do well against Kylo Red. Like Double Blue Iden, for example, is a list that can actually do well against Kylo Red because that's what they're trying to do, is control the board, heal up, and defeat all your units. But in some cases, Kylo could just outpace them and just absolutely murder your opponent. And that's where Kylo Red is really scary. things like Chaos of War can do 4 to 5 damage in some of the matchups because a lot of people are trying to draw a bunch of cards. Your Fallen Lightsaber on your Kylo Ren can still be very good. You get access to Bo-Katan in double red. You get access to Benthic 2 Tubes, which always has a target because of every single card in your deck is red. You get access to Aggression, which is really powerful in certain matchups. And you even get some nice sideboard cards in Saw Gerrera. This thing kills faster than any deck in Star Wars Unlimited, with the exception being maybe Sabine Green, in that Sabine Green can also kill fast. But usually both of them have a chance of killing on turn 3, but usually Kylo Ren can do it a little bit more consistently, which is pretty crazy to consider. And he just does so much work. I really like it, and it's a lot of fun. But definitely a very swingy list. He has very high potential, but also a very low floor. Next one on our list is Lando. And unfortunately for Lando, this is a leader that I had some high hopes for when we initially saw him spoiled. But I was really waiting to see if we were going to get some smuggle cards that make sense to play with Lando. Like if we were going to see, you know, 4 resource 5/5s, and we could play them on, well, potentially like turn 1 if we put them on smuggle, and then we just get it down on turn 1. Like that could be something that's exciting. We really didn't see any of that. And the most powerful thing you could do with Lando, in this case double yellow Lando, is smuggle out a DJ for 5 resources. But you could already do that with tech and DJ, so it kind of negates that purpose. You can run tech in the Lando deck, and that is fine, but it's not as consistent as Han, and you don't really have the same threat potential with getting the 7 drops out. Yes, he deploys on 4, but he's only a 2/5. Usually getting those smuggle cards out has to be a little bit later because you don't want to be going down resources until you deploy Lando, and even afterwards you usually want to get to 5 resources and do that type of stuff. So to me, this is a C tier leader. I've been pretty unimpressed with Lando. I've tried. I do like cunning, and I do like going ahead and building decks around that and trying to go with that theme. The problem with Lando is that his action is just not strong enough when all your smuggle cards actually cost more than what they do on the front side. Like think Hot Shot Blaster, right? Like yes, you can smuggle that out with Lando, but it's now just a 1 resource, essentially worst surprise strike. Let's say your leader or your unit lives, then yeah, you might get an initial damage in with it, but you had to defeat a resource to do that. Or let's say getting down like a jetpack. Like now you just played a 2 resource jetpack, which you could have done by not resourcing it. So is that really worth it? Not usually. So Lando here gonna be a C tier leader for me. Next up, we got ourselves Leia Red, my favorite original set 1 leader, or at least the one I had the most fun with within set 1. For those of you that don't know, this was the very first video I posted on this channel, at least, was my Leia Red deck that I had in paper. It was really powerful. Leia Red with set 1 was really nice. There were some top 8 finishes across some tournaments. In set 2, she didn't really get that much. There were a couple of cards, like I have tried playing Poe and Wrecker in Leia Red. Unfortunately, they're not Rebels, which is a downside, but also you don't have ECL. And if you don't have ECL with Poe and Wrecker, they get a decent amount weaker, like a lot weaker, to the point where I'm not like extremely excited to play them, although they can be good. Instead, the cards that I really look towards is like Cassian. Cassian was the biggest upgrade that you got in Leia, but it's not quite enough to carry her to the point where I'm like really excited to be playing Leia Red. It's not like her deck is bad by any means. She was one of like the top A tier decks, tier 1.5 I would have put in set 1. And she still holds the same power that she did in set 1 and got a little bit better. But because she didn't get a lot better, like a lot of these lists that are in A and S tier, to me, she's more of like a higher B tier list, where you're still playing the same Rebel synergy package. You're still getting in a lot of damage, but you're just not quite getting there enough with Leia Red to be an A or S tier deck. Next up, we got some Lukes. We got Luke Green and Luke Red. Not many people have been talking about Luke Red. I know it's something that I posted recently just to kind of get a little bit of spin on Luke. Both of these are actually quite solid. I think in general, my experience has been between Luke Red and Luke Green is that Luke Red is actually the stronger variant. That's just because of how Pillage and Force Throw actually shape up in the meta. So to me, Luke Red actually ends up somewhere around like the bottom of A tier. It's not quite as good as some of the other Vigilance red combinations, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But it's also pretty powerful regardless, because of you just being able to play good cards that are good against a lot of the matchups. Like if you're fighting against Han, for example, and you're able to get rid of a lot of their cards in their hand, they don't have the actual card quantity to do what they're trying to do. And you can really do that easily with force throws. And you can even discard big things with force throws to kill their units if you have the right kind of synergy. But you can also do this with other decks. It's just that Luke does the same thing that a lot of other red Vigilance decks, or specifically one that we're going to talk about later, does. It's just that you get a little bit of a different spin on it with shield tokens and a Luke deploy. Luke Green, on the other hand, I have been reasonably impressed with it. I think it's a reasonable list. It's similar to Iden Green and Krennic Green, where you're trying to play this like mid-range, more restore-oriented ramp style, where you're trying to play like Sonari Peacekeepers, play like Alliance Dispatchers, play your units a little bit ahead of curve, and then just kind of outvalue your opponent, but not really answering their threats, more just playing bigger threats and restoring through the damage and trading off that way. But unfortunately for us, there are a lot of ways that goes wrong, and there's not enough value out of Luke's action to make it extremely powerful. To me, this is like a top end of the B tier list. A little bit worse than Luke Red, but still decent enough to be able to play here. Next up, we got ourselves Mandalorian Blue. Now, Mandalorian Blue is one of the lists that people were really excited about when we saw the starter deck reveal with the spoiler season. I know I was, and I was excited what you could do with Jedi lightsabers and devotions and things like that. It is a very powerful tempo list. And if you're against things like, well, Kylo Red or Grand Inquisitor Blue, or these more traditional aggro lists without the tempo aspect associated with it, Mando Blue does some major work. But as soon as you start coming up against Boba Greens, Boba Yellows, Han Greens, heck, even Bossk Greens or double yellow Hans, like these types of lists where they're not as reliant as playing units and getting in damage, that's where Mando starts to falter a lot. Not to mention, they are very reliant on upgrades and actually explicitly playing upgrades. So there's sometimes where it's very inconsistent, where you have all the upgrades and none of the units, and all the units and no upgrades, so you can't actually get the value going. So the inconsistency and the mismatch, especially when you're up against like mid-range ramp decks, it can be really brutal for you, especially if you come against Traitorous. Ooh, it's nasty. To me, this is like a bottom of the B tier list, a little bit better than some of the weaker, aggro or synergy decks, but still something that can do some work and has some good matchups. Absolutely hoses Kylo Red, by the way, but also gets absolutely hosed by like Jabba Yellow or even Jabba Red, for example. So really depends on the matchup with this one. Now, earlier I was talking a lot about, okay, if you're playing red-green heroism, if you're doing this or you're doing that type of strategy, what should you be playing instead? And this is one of the leaders I was talking about in Boba Fett, okay? Boba Fett here, he just gives you extra damage while just playing your cards normally. And this could actually be a little bit more advantageous than playing even like the Sabine action, which guarantees you a damage with Sabine's action, right? Boba's isn't guaranteed, which is an important thing to remember. So in some matchups, it can be a lot worse. But also, if you're in the aggro mirror, you don't have to do a damage to yourself in order to get that extra power. And in some cases, that extra power can help you trade with opponents' units. This is a really powerful green-red heroism deck. The biggest problem with Boba Fett, and I will say this is a pretty big problem, is the fact that you can't run ECL. The fact that you can't run ECL makes Boba Fett a lot weaker, because the two most powerful heroism cards in red are Poe Dameron and Wrecker. And usually you have all sorts of stuff in your earlier 1 to 4 drops. And then on 5 drops, you have 3 copies of Poe. And on 6 drops, you have 3 copies of Wrecker. And that's it. Those cards, when you have ECL, are nightmares to fight against. They just end the game. When you don't have ECL, they're kind of a little bit scary, but you usually have a way to deal with them. And that's a big difference, because aggro is all about guaranteeing that damage. He does flip on 6 as a 4/7, but unlike the other 6 flips that are 4 power units, this one pumps up all your keyworded units, and you usually have 2 to 3 of them on the battlefield by this point, and it pumps them all up. So they just get straight up extra damage, which can be really, really nice for you. So you could actually get a lot of damage in with Boba Fett flip. I've been pretty impressed with this. I think it's a really solid aggro list, but like the Heras and like the Jins that I talked about, it's still got some really powerful contenders for cards that are just significantly better than, you know, its red-green base. So with that in mind, while it is solid and I'm pretty happy with playing Boba, just getting in all this extra damage, it's still not really close to the other two red-green heroism leaders that we have left. Now, earlier I mentioned Kylo Ren is one of my favorite leaders to play in set 2, but a little bit of a tie between another leader. That other leader is the new Han Solo. This has just been absolutely a blast. You guarantee get yourself ramp with the Han Solo action. And as soon as I saw this leader, I said that this is going to be one of the most broken, if not the most broken set 2 leader. And at least from what we've seen so far, I am spot on with that one. It competes with some of the other set 2 leaders, or at least one other set 2 leader that we've seen so far. But this new Han does some major work, and it has so many flavors right now. The first being that we're going to talk about is Han Blue. Now, this is the least popular version, but it still does some really good work. I've tried all 3 versions. This is more focused on playing like grit synergy units, where you get to play grit units for cheaper, but then they get to go ahead and get some extra power. I think that what the problem with this is, I don't even care about playing like cheap units and getting the grit power, because you could just play higher value units by ramping with Han Solo anyways. And so you can kind of ignore this and just get the extra damage in anyways. And so while he is good and he can synergize quite well, he's a little bit more of like a middle of the B tier road with Han Solo Blue. Han Green, on the other hand, this has 2 variations within it itself. Unlike all the other lists here, like Boba Yellow, Boba Green, these are decks that are set in stone for the most part. Like you're going to be playing Boba Yellow and you're going to be playing a tempo aggro list. There are different flavors in terms of like, I want to play 3 copies of Forlom, or I want to play 3 copies of Gamorrean Guard. But for the most part, they have the same game plan and the same strategy. Same with like Boba Green. Han Green, on the other hand, the new Han Green has 2 distinct versions. A mid-range, well, I didn't even say mid-range, a ramp-heavy deck trying to get to things like Reinforcement Walker, Marauders, Crate Dragons, and like just ramping all the way up the curve, playing some early restore units and getting to Crate Dragons. That is one way. The other way is to play a hardcore red-green aggro list, where you get to play Poe Dameron on turn 3s. You get to literally just go turn 1 Sundari Peacekeeper, turn 2 K2, turn 3 Poe Dameron, and that is a really hard curve to beat. Even though your units are taking damage, you could still get in damage with those into your opponent's base. And in some cases, you could even play multiple units, like A-Wing plus a 1-drop, or turn 2, like A-Wing plus A-Wing. Like that type of stuff can be really powerful. And both of those are S tier decks, at least from what we've seen so far. Now, I will say, this is a lot more of the experience I've had within the online meta than it is in the tournaments. We've only seen a couple tournaments so far, and Han Green hasn't really shown itself in the top 8 yet. I'm not sure what the actual makeup of the decks in the entrances of the tournaments were, so I don't know if that's because Han like had some bad matchups, or if it was people weren't just playing Han Green. I'm not sure, but at least from what we've seen so far, this does some major domination right now. Han Red, on the other hand, is also extremely powerful, and it actually has shown up in a top 8, at least one deck so far. Now, despite it showing up in the top 8, this one is definitely more of the aggro-centric list, and leverages the fact that you just get that extra ramp guaranteed. You just play high value units, play the double red strategy, have some burn, and just get in and kill your opponent. It's not quite as lethal as the Han Green, but it is still an A tier list, close to S tier. These 2 lists are exceptionally powerful, and the fact that Han Green, the new Han, has 2 lists close to the S tier just goes to show you how powerful it actually is. And again, I'm sure as set 2 goes onwards, we're going to see more of the new Han, even though we've only seen a little bit of him right now within the small amount of turn-ins that we had. Into our next couple of leaders, we got ourselves Palpatine Green and Palpatine Yellow. Now, Palpatine is another leader that I've had a lot of fun with within set 1. And this first one in double green Palpatine actually did see a top 8 finish. In fact, actually taking down the entirety of the cash tournament last week when we saw the first cast service take place within set 2. Double grade Palp was one of the first decks I showcased within set 2 because of the massive amount of ramp that you can provide with commands, price on your heads, super laser techs, resupplies. It just gets really crazy really quickly. In that deck, I also try to play Endless Legions, even though I don't think that card's very good at all. Just playing the double green version here and getting to ramp to exceptional levels is really crazy. And I've even seen people put in Super Laser Blast into their double green Palp deck, even in the sideboard, or just ramping into Crate Dragons, even though it costs 11, because of the fact that you just get so much ramp with Palpatine, and you're able to actually get to an early Palpatine very frequently. And it can be very devastating to a lot of different decks. This is actually a really powerful list, and I would put it very, very similar to the new Han double red, where if you're able to ramp and you're able to get to the checkpoints that you need to, you're going to see Palpatine kind of be unbeatable, and that could be a little bit scary, but it does have some weaknesses, and it's not quite S tier level, but it is a very powerful ramp deck. Palpatine Yellow was kind of the go-to Palpatine list in set 1 for most people nearing the end of set 1, and it still is pretty good, and it did get some upgrades, but I do think that compared to a lot of the other lists that we had from set 1s, it didn't really get that much of an upgrade. You have things like Vorlom and Zuckus, which can be pretty good. You do have some of the new ramp cards like Price on Your Head if you want to play those, but it didn't really get like a huge power boost that I was excited to see. And for that, I'm gonna have to drop it nearing the kind of middle of B tier here, which is a decent showing for Palpatine and definitely got a lot better from set 1. Next one on our list is QiRa Green. This is a list I've had a lot of fun with, and I do think this is one of those leaders that a lot of people underrated or are still underrating from set 2. Not that it's like a powerhouse, but I think a lot of people view QiRa as like this unplayable, like, oh, it's a 4/4 on deploy, and like I don't even know what you're supposed to do with her deploy ability where it like heals everyone and deals damage to everything. It's more about using QiRa as an event rather than an actual deploy, and using her as a way to kill a specific target like an enemy leader, and then just getting more value out of your units along the curve with the shield tokens. But there are some major downsides, and that is the fact that you don't really use your leader as a threat. It's more of an event, and that can be a lot weaker in a lot of games, especially if you're against things that can prevent that from happening and keep their own leader alive. So you do have to keep that in mind, and it does really falter against upgrade destruction, where you can get rid of the shield tokens, and then suddenly you're playing damaged units, and they just kind of die to everything. So she ends up in kind of like the middle to bottom of B tier. Very, very much matchup dependent, similar to Mandalorian Blue, where some games you're just going to be able to get a shield token and like kill every one of their units in Kylo Red, or you're going to be in a situation where you're fighting, I don't know, something like Cad Bane, and they're just dealing 1 damage to all your units every turn, and it's just getting rid of all those shields, and you're really sad, right? That can be pretty brutal. So really depends on the matchup. One of, if not the most popular leaders from set 2 in Rey is next up, and we got Rey Green and Rey Red. Rey Green is definitely the lesser of the two in terms of power level and popularity, but it is still a very powerful list. There are very, very strong green cards, like Sundari Peacekeeper is a perfect example, that give you so much value with Rey's action, and you also get to leverage the fact that you're playing Energy Conversion Lab in a deck because it's just that powerful. But Rey just gives you so much value. I was a little bit off put when I first saw Rey, when I saw the 2/6, and I was like, oh dang, that just seems really bad. But what really ended up impressing me was the fact that she has Restore 3. That Restore 3 is obnoxious, and she ends up becoming a 3/7 on attacks, which we knew at the time, but that actually just gives you so much value. The Restore 3 makes it so that you actually do have to deal with Rey, and that could be a problem with some aggro decks, because sometimes it's just impossible to deal with Rey, because they have things like Obi-Wan, they have things like Jedi Lightsaber or whatnot to actually prevent it from happening. This is actually a pretty powerful list. I'm going to put it nearing the kind of top end of B tier. Rey Red, on the other hand, is the more popular and more powerful version. We've actually seen this, I believe, take 2 top 8 spots already in some recent tournaments. And what card has impressed me the most in this list is Pillage. I did not expect Pillage, and I think a lot of people did not expect Pillage to actually be this powerhouse of a card in a lot of matchups. It makes sense against Control, and I did see it being played there. But the decks that are actually really falling against the Pillage kind of card are the ramp decks. The fact that in Star Wars your cards are resourced no matter what, like that's how you get a land. Like, it's not like you can discard lands like in Magic or anything like that. You just end up in a situation where your opponent has like 2 or 3 cards in hand and they can't afford a ramp because they can't make plays, ramp, and resource every turn with them being pillaged. And that can really slow down their game plan. But it also works really well against Boba Yellow, and it works really well against Han Green because Han Green kind of needs those cards in hand to use his action, and Boba Yellow needs the combination of events and units. That doesn't mean that Rey Red is like a good matchup into Boba Yellow necessarily. It just means that that card specifically can do some work. To me, this is, I would actually put Rey Red in the bottom of S tier. It has performed really quite well, and I've been really impressed with Rey Red. I was, again, a little bit skeptical when we first saw the spoilers, but as I've played more and more, you really do have to play around certain cards in the Rey Red matchup or you will get overrun. Not to mention, she also has the Force Throw synergies, and that can be really powerful, as we saw with Chirrut Red in set 1, and we're seeing in set 2 with Rey Red. I know a lot of you have been waiting for this, waiting to see where your Sabine Green would end up, but this one, arguably, is one of the most powerful decks in all of Star Wars Unlimited. I am tempted. I've seen, there are different flavors of Sabine Green, which we'll talk about in just a moment. This is by far one of the most threatening decks in the entire meta. I would go to say that Sabine Green is actually, in general, more devastating than Boba Yellow, but it has to be the right variant. And the reason why Sabine Green is so devastating is the fact that you have the standard, well, you can go either Darksaber, which I think is more situational than the just guaranteed damage version of Sabine, which with Rebel, Rebel synergies with like Fleet Lieutenant and Wing Leader, because you just kind of guarantee those damage, which is which is really, really important. But you also have an amazing mid game with Sabine Green, which previously was not the case. In old version of Sabine Green, it was like, okay, I get to turn 4, which is just after Sabine flipped, and if I can't finish the game here, I'm going to get outpaced. But the new Sabine Green with ECL Podamerons and Wreckers can actually just still get in additional damage that you otherwise would not have been able to. ECL Wrecker can sometimes do 6 damage to your opponent's base and actually can one-shot a Boba, which otherwise was not able to happen. Heck, you can one-shot Boba Yellow leader or Boba leader with a Podameron on turn 4, the same time that Boba flips. That is an exceptional difference. And the only really other way to deal with Boba leader in set 1 was a Steadfast Battalion ECL'd out with Sabine. But people knew about that, so you could just kill Sabine and move on with your life. But now, you can just straight up kill things with a Podameron ECL. That gives her so much more game against Boba, which was one of her toughest matchups, and also just completely wrecks some decks. Again, Rey comes down, you ECL at a Wrecker, you hit them for 6 and kill Rey. Let's say they play an Obi-Wan before they deploy Rey, you can ECL a Wrecker. Boom, kill Obi-Wan, kill or hit them for a bunch. You have time interventions with Podamerons and Wreckers even for after the fact that you have used ECL. You have an amazing curve. You have Cassians to potentially get in damage a little bit later. You just have so many additional options, and you have even better sideboard options as Sabine. It might be crazy of me to say. We did see some Sabine Green in the top 8 tournaments. I think Sabine is going to be a leader that's going to pop up more and more and more. I think there's a combination of, you can kind of swap between these two depending on kind of how your meta shapes up. I wouldn't blame if anyone put Boba Yellow at the top, and I wouldn't blame anyone if they put Sabine Green at the top. But for me, I lean a little bit more towards Sabine Green. And that was a lot of talk just for Sabine Green, but we also have to talk about Sabine Red and Sabine Yellow. Sabine Red is also amazing. You get access to things like Chaos of War, Bo-Katan, which are very powerful cards. You even get Wild Rancors if you want to play Wild Rancors. The big downside with Sabine Red is that you don't get access to ECL. And that's a big, big downside. But you do get access to more direct damage, and that can put you in a little bit of a different place than Sabine Green. You don't have as much game against things like Boba, because your Boba player can just tempo you out, especially when you don't have a great way to deal with Boba leader. But you do have better game against things that are maybe ramping and preventing you from actually getting any units on the board. Even if you do have ECL Wrecker, it's not going to kill things like, well, Reinforcement Walker all that easy and get in for damage, or things like Crate Dragon and stuff like that. And that's where direct damage comes into play. So to me, this is more of like a bottom A tier list, maybe closer to the middle of A tier in Sabine Red. Sabine Yellow, on the other hand, has a little bit of a different strategy. It is much more of a low to the ground, evasive deck. Sabine Green is just straight up lots of damage, get in for damage, and your opponent's gonna want to trade with your units, but it doesn't matter because you just have like high quality units and you just got in for a bunch of damage. And then in the mid game, you're just gonna finish it off with ECL. Sabine Red is all about direct damage and getting that in. Sabine Yellow is all about space. Because you have things like Cartel Turncoat, you have Millennium Falcon, both very strong. You have things like Surprise Strike, Hotshot Blaster, which can work well with some of your space units, or Surprise Strike space units, and Hotshot Blaster with Sabine could be very powerful because Sabine's a little bit harder to take out. That could be really nice. You have things like, your Greedos on turn 1 to help you kind of flood the board, and that's kind of what Sabine Yellow can do. It is a little bit better than Sabine Red, but still weaker than, from what I've found, the Sabine Green list. It is very impressive that Sabine has 3 decks within the A and S tier, and that is just to go, just goes and shows you how powerful aggro is right now in the meta, and how powerful guaranteeing damage in with Sabine action and having a very quick to deploy leader that deals 3 on attacks, which is really, really crazy. So yeah, Sabine, pretty good, still going to be good, and might even just be the best deck in the format. But we still have 3 more lists to talk about, and the next one is probably the most budget-friendly, most competitive list on this entire tier list. You look at Bossk Green, you're playing Darth Vaders, you're playing probably Crate Dragons, Palp, you're playing Mauls, you're playing Darth Vaders, Double Red Han, you're playing Crate Dragons in some cases, or I mean, you might be just playing an aggressive list with Wild Rancors. All these lists, like Boba Fett, you're playing Boba Fett's in, all of them, a couple $100 oftentimes. Tarkin, $40, very competitive, and I'm gonna put it at the top of A tier. It is a very, very powerful list. The thing that's preventing me from putting it into S tier is it's one of those lists that if your opponent knows what you're doing, it gets a lot weaker. If your opponent doesn't know what you're doing, then you can just surprise them with so much damage. Things like triple dark rating in an ATST and just killing a unit, getting overwhelmed damage, or triple dark rating in a TIE Advance to pump up your units. Getting a TIE Phantom out there just completely hoses control decks. A Snow Trooper Lieutenant with ISB agents or Incinerator Troopers can clear the board and set up for the next turn. It is very impressive what Tarkin can do very quickly. And he comes down very early, and he's kind of hard to get rid of, but you don't really care if they get rid of him because all you're doing is using him as a way to get in 3 damage. And the way you get 3 damage is attacking, get an experience token to something else, and then attacking with that. So it's kind of like a 5 deploy, 3 powered unit, but also pumps up the other units that's harder for them to deal with and gives you permanent additional damage for them. It just ends up being a very cohesive list. It ends up being pretty consistent, and it ends up being very hard to deal with because a lot of people aren't prepared to deal with all those space units. And again, similar to the way Sabine Yellow wins space units, Tarkin Yellow also wins. Although there are some matchups where you can just completely annihilate someone's ground board with like an Incinerator Trooper, which is pretty cool as well. Next up on our list is a leader that I was really hoping that was going to have a chance in Thrawn Blue. Definitely a more hard control list and has some tempo advantages and is one of the better control lists, if I could even say that, but doesn't actually do as much as like Iden Blue or even Iden Green or some of the other control lists that we have in like Boba Blue, for example. This is a list that does have some advantages, the ability to exhaust leaders or exhaust units with the, kind of reveal on top of the deck, and having that extra information can do some decent amount of work for you. And you do get access to evacuates, frozen and carbonates, which are very strong removal cards or tempo plays that can get you back in an advantage. The problem with Thrawn is that the way to end the game is so difficult with Avenger, with how the meta is shaping up right now. Either you just get aggroed out completely, or someone plays a TIE Phantom and it's like completely over for you, or they get down a Crate Dragon and you play an Avenger and like, yeah, you might have defeated the Crate Dragon, but you probably just died by playing an Avenger. That's the type of situation that becomes very difficult with Control. And for me, even though Thrawn does have some advantages, it's going to be like the bottom of B tier. It's gotten a little bit better, and it's gotten out of the C tier from last set, but it's still not quite there. It is still very, very weak, and you could even argue that it should be in C tier. And you know what? Maybe it should just be the top of C tier, because we have a lot of B tier decks in terms of kind of how they compare against the other decks and how they shape up against the meta. And Thrawn, if you look at the top of the meta, all these lists are hard for it to deal with. Like the discard from Rey can be difficult. Sabine Green just one-shots it. Boba Yellow can really do some major things and get in for a lot of damage. Han Green can spark Rebellion and ramp into Ewing reinforcements, which is hard to deal with. Tarkin puts TIE Phantom down. Boba can have TIE Phantoms as well. Palp's ramping into Crate Dragons. Han Green's ramping into Crate Dragons. It's like, wow, how can you deal with any of these lists? Really, it's really, really quite tough. And that's where Thrawn ends up at the bottom of the tier list. Vader Green is the last list we have to talk about. And this is a list that I'm surprised I have not seen more of. And maybe this is a hot take, but I'm going to put Vader actually in S tier. I think that Vader Green just shapes up really well against kind of what the meta is trying to go and do. Things like Phase 3 Dark Trooper, Yulorans, things like Salacious Crumb in certain matchups, Escort Skiffs, but also playing things like Imperial Interceptors and doing all this random nonsense that Vader Green was normally doing, but having way better abilities to ramp and way better abilities to get to Darth Vader himself, and having a way better top end puts it in the top of kind of the meta. I think that you could argue that it is a little bit worse than Boba Green, and I could see that argument. And in fact, maybe Boba Green should actually be in S tier, just above Darth Vader, if I'm putting Darth Vader in S tier. And that seems reasonable to me, because these two decks kind of do something similar, but Boba comes down a little bit earlier and leverages the additional resources. And you can get aggroed out as Vader in some situations, but there are a lot of different areas where Vader is just going to outvalue you. And this, to me, is the best Crate Dragon deck. Rey plays Crate Dragon, Han Green plays Crate Dragon, like the new Han Green plays Crate Dragon. Your Han Red can sometimes play Crate Dragon, Bossk can play Crate Dragon, but Vader allows you to ramp into Crate Dragons while also playing such an impactful leader that he can kind of wipe the board before Crate Dragon even comes down, which is really, really quite relevant as well. I think Boba Green and Vader Green are very comparable, but I do find that Boba Green is, in general, against the meta, a little bit stronger. So I think it wouldn't be fair for me to put Boba Green in the top of A tier and Darth Vader in S tier. And I think it's pretty fair to put Boba Green in S tier anyways. It's just a really powerful deck. We'll see if people even try to play Boba Green, because I do think Boba Yellow is just straight up better. But also, Vader Green, something to think about. Something to think about if you're coming to any of these tournaments, guys. The one downside that Boba Green has against Vader Green is Boba Green doesn't play Crate Dragons usually, but it may not even need to. Anyways, that's going to be the last placement on the list. We got Vader Green in S tier. Let's talk about some final thoughts. So hopefully you all enjoyed. I know that this was a long video, and I'm certain that a lot of you are going to disagree. Why is my Finn Green at the bottom of C tier? With Darth Vader's no way there's that guy's that good. Why do you talk about Han Green? These guys haven't even shown up in a top 8 tournament last week or whatever. I'm sure there are some disagreements, maybe some just strong agreements, and maybe you agree with maybe some hot takes I had. I don't even know what's a hot take and what's not necessarily, because the meta isn't really shaped up. But this is just my early set 2 impressions and what we're seeing out of my many games on the online meta, because really the paper meta hasn't really sorted itself out yet. Whether people are still getting the cards acquired to go to these tournaments, or whether or not they're just trying to play some guaranteed good decks. Like Boba Yellow is kind of a solidified good deck. Sabine Green is a solidified good deck. That's why we saw those guys show up. Same with Han Green. Same with, well, I guess Tarkin Yellow is kind of a new ball, but we'll probably see some newer decks show up as time goes on, and we'll see the meta shape itself as the time goes on. I will say we haven't really figured out control yet. Whether it's possible or not, I'm not sure. Whether or not we can kind of figure out a list that actually does have at least a good game one against a lot of people, it depends. Because if you look at the top of the meta, there are a lot of decks that control really has a tough time against. So that is one thing I'm concerned about. I will say, compared to set 1, the meta is maybe a little bit less diverse, because you're seeing a lot more, well, tempo or aggro, which is kind of like a similar style of deck, and then mid-range / ramp style of decks. You're not really seeing any control in the meta at the top of the meta right now. In set 1, you were seeing soft control, hard control. You're seeing mid-range, like without much ramp. You're also seeing like hardcore ramp or mid-range ramp. You're seeing like hardcore tempo in Boba Yellow. You're seeing hardcore aggro. So you had a little bit more options, but also same thing could have been said for early set 1, which is why I said this is early set 2 tier list for the decks that we have currently. And I imagine when we come back to this in like a month from now or whatever, I'll have a bunch more decks to include, ideally, that we haven't really seen right now, or maybe we kind of discounted because we haven't found the right combination of cards. I know I can't figure out all the lists. That's kind of why the community exists and why all of the, you know, tournaments are out there. We can learn from that information, and that's what the community is all about. So I'm hoping that this will develop, and I'm curious about what your opinions are in the comment section down below. I'm a little surprised at some of these lists, to be honest. One of the big ones was Tarkin Yellow. Initially, I was not a huge fan of it, but that's because I am, I guess, pre-sideboarded against Tarkin Yellow. I play Traitorous in the main deck just because of how the Star Wars Online meta is right now. Like, Traitorous just ends up being something that is so good against so many decks that it's worth playing like 1 to 2 copies of. So, you know, sometimes Tarkin Yellow gets hosed by that. Another deck that I was a little bit surprised to see up this high is actually Grand Inquisitor Blue. This has just been super impressive in how aggressive it can deal with a lot of different stuff. Same with Ray Red. I was also surprised to see this one up this high in terms of how it's performed. But these are just kind of the impressions, and in some cases just the results of tournaments. So thanks for watching. This was a long video. I had put a ton of effort into this one. So if you made it to the end of the video, let me know. Let's see. What can we comment? Just comment like, I don't know, love for Dr. Aphra. I really wish Dr. Aphra was a good leader in the comment section down below, or let me know any other way to let me know that you made it this far in the video. Leave a like. Subscribe, guys. But I think if you made it to this far in the video, probably subscribe. Or maybe you're like me and you're like driving and you're watching this as a podcast for like 2 hours, get some background music, or maybe you're just going to sleep and you're not even listening to this part of the video. So it's like I don't know how long this video is, but no one's gonna hear this part anyway, so we're gonna ramble for a little bit. Anyways, thanks for watching. Really do appreciate it, and I'll see you all for the next video.